それではこれより全体会合1。
We would like to get started with Plenary Session 1, Challenges to Democratic Political System and the Liberal International Order. Would the moderator and the panelists come up to the stage? Let me introduce the moderator and the panelists. To your left, we have Professor Hiroshi Nakanishi of Kyoto University, Ms. Avril Haines, former White House Deputy National Security Advisor and former Deputy Director of CIA, Professor Yuichi Hosoya of Keio University, Senior Adjunct Fellow of JIIA, and Mr. Thierry du Montbrial, Executive Chairman of a French Institute of International Relations, Ambassador Kenichiro Sasae, President of JIIA, and Dr. Robert Ward, Japan Chair of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Nakanishi. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
In this session, and since the majority of the audience is Japanese, I talk in Japanese. But if there is something unclear because of not the translation problem, but because of my Japanese problem, please, just notice me that you don't hear well. 日本語で司会をさせ
So allow me to moderate the session in Japanese. So we have heard from 3 keynote speakers and also the opening remark by the JIIA President and Foreign Minister. And so we have 3 people who have already taken the floor to take part in the panel discussion. So as you go through the program, I think the 2-day Tokyo Global Dialogue takes up a great variety of topics. In the plenary session, we have in the afternoon, we take up this relationship between U.S.-China strategic rivalry, and we are going to talk about the New Order in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as various other international security-related issues. And we have a total of 6 breakout sessions over the 2 days, which leads to a great variety of topics that needs to be addressed. So this is the first plenary session. And we are given the mission to lay the groundwork for the discussions to ensue. Therefore, we have to really lay the foundation for the 2-day discussion. But before we get into the discussion, allow me to share with you the impression that I have acquired listening to the keynote speeches and my expectation for this global dialogue. I think there are good news and bad news. Starting with the bad news. Well, the sessions after this take up very specific topic. But here, for this plenary session, we don't really have a very specific, concrete subject to discuss. We only have this very broad subject having to do with global civilization, which I interpret is something that we have to address. Ms. Haines and Mr. Montbrial and Ambassador Sasae already mentioned that thinking about the current world to discuss international order is of course important, but there are things that cannot be addressed just from the international problem perspective. So it's very difficult to pinpoint the exact expression or word that we should use. But I think one possible candidate would be civilization, to really think about the civilization, what form the civilization should take going forward. And of course, experts are limited, very limited in the world about civilization. We're quite ignorant about civilization, and to have to moderate a very difficult session is a very bad news, at least for me. But turning on to the good news, the role of this session is this session is to take up problems related to global civilization, but we don't need to really come up with answers. We're not expected to come up with answers because discussions are to really take place on various topics, and in each session, in-depth dialogue can take place, and perhaps we are expected to give a new perspective. So in that regard, this session doesn't necessarily have to arrive at a conclusion or come up with an answer. Still, my mission can be accomplished. Therefore, having said so, the current global civilization, this is the overarching theme for us. And from about 3 perspectives, I would like to raise issues that I would like you to address. Last night in the welcome reception, a point was made that for the past 30 years after the Cold War, how are we to evaluate the global situation? So today's the 2nd of December, and 30 years ago in Malta, President Bush and President Gorbachev met and declared the end of the Cold War. And 30 years has passed already, and the West had become a Victorian, and the West had been the victor of this Cold War, is the recognition, or was the recognition of the world. But many point out that this view was too optimistic. So, recalling the year 1989, and if we open the history book, in China on the 4th of June, there was this Tiananmen Square incident, and the Chinese Communist Party had exercised the force to oppress the demonstrators in the Tiananmen Square, and China is the 2nd superpower in the world. So how are we to assess this 30-year history? And although it may not have been as great in scale as Tiananmen Square incident, but in February 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, and we thought that that was this evidence of this victory of the West in the Cold War. But Osama bin Laden had led the Islamic radicalists, and Al-Qaeda at that time was given birth in Afghanistan at that time. Japan, the United States, and the European countries at that time was not fully cognizant of the implications. And 12 years after that, 9/11 took place, and this was really shocked the world. So those are the historical incidents that I'm interested in. And after the global financial crisis, and the order of the society and the economy changed since then. So in 2008, there was this global financial crisis, and with this, the capitalism, the confidence of the Western capitalism had faltered. And it was the year of the Beijing Olympics. And so this led China to come to realize that the Western world is no longer just the only leader of the world. And from 2009 or 2007 to 2008, there was a major transformation in the world. Smartphone was developed around that time. iPhone. Apple developed iPhone in 2007, and in 2008, Google came up with this Android-based smartphone. Twitter's got started. Well, President Trump likes to tweet, but Twitter got started in 2008.
And I call this the digital mass society, the start of a digital mass society. That's how I recognize this shift. And now, as represented by China, the world is being swept over by digital Leninism that is to enforce authoritarian rule using digital technology. Digital populism in the United States and Europe is very rampant, and in other parts of the world, that is the use of digital technology to for populist movements that are unprecedented are now moving politics, and that's a new movement and issue for all of us. The third point is about liberalism. A free and fair order or liberal international order, we talk about such things very lightly, but the liberalism or liberalist thoughts is very, very ambiguous and very broad. And the current challenge, in order to face up to the current challenge facing us, I think that we must, although while respecting liberalism, I think we need to redefine or rethink what liberalism actually entails. So if we look back on history, a similar challenge occurred in the 1930s, and one response to that challenge was a symposium. In 1938 in France, the Walter Lippmann Colloquium, the Walter Lippmann Conference was held. And Mr. Lippmann, who is a very famous critic in the United States, wrote a book called Good Society, and that triggered Louis Leger, a French philosopher who gathered together many experts to discuss about liberalism. And with this conference as a trigger, the word neoliberalism was born. And this is actually the opposite of neoliberalism as we know it today. And it's a classic, against the Adam Smith classic liberalism, it was a revisionist type of capitalism. That is a social, democratic type of liberalism. That's what neoliberalism was back then. And this conference discussed whether neoliberalism is good or the conventional liberalism. And there was no conclusion. But I think that conference, I think, gave rise to the spread of liberalism as a founding principle for the Western society in the world. And I hope that this conference can serve as a Walter Lippmann colloquial. But as we learn from history, I think it's necessary to rethink the significance of liberalism or to discuss more deeply about what liberalism really entails. That is my viewpoint. So I'm sorry I talked too long as a moderator at the outset, so I will not intervene too much from now on. And therefore, I would like to ask you to take the floor now. And first of all, I'd like to call upon the two speakers, Mr. Robert Ward and also Professor Yuichi Hosoya, who have not spoken up to now. And we'd like to ask these two individuals to speak first. So let me I guess it's the role of a moderator to introduce the speakers, but you have their curriculum vitae on hand, I'm sure, in the pamphlet. And so I will cut short any introductions. So starting from the very right, Mr. Ward, could you start, please? He belongs to the Economist Intelligence Unit. And he will talk from a UK perspective. Well, I'm not saying he represents the UK, but he will, based on these discussions so far, I think I'll talk about his views on these issues for about 10 minutes.
Introduction. Also like to thank Ambassador Sasae for this and the organizers for this great event. And we've had some excellent speeches this morning, much food for thought and much to agree with many of them. I do need to start by just addressing Thierry's comment about the liberal order. Absolutely, you're correct about, in the sort of strictest sense, about this. However, I think the question that we had after your speech about the not letting the perfect crowd out the good, I think was spot on. Whatever we had post 1945 was unstable, was highly flexible, and yes, the strong states did sort of push the weaker ones around, and yes, absolutely, weaker states do need rules. But the way I look at it is as this sort of liberal or international order is as a sort of shorthand for a US-led system of alliances, multilateral organizations, and so on. Whatever we want to call it, I think we have to recognize that this system, whatever it was, did deliver the longest, most explosive period of increase in human prosperity since history began. So whatever we call it, I think, whatever it was, it was very important because it sustained the prosperity that we all enjoy today. In the first speeches, one of the sort of takeaways that I had was the important centrality, the recognition of the importance of the liberal international order for managing conflict, for delivering prosperity. And as I've just said, this is why this debate, how liberal international order goes forward, is so absolutely central, not just here, but also for the whole world. I think it's also absolutely right to ask what sort of rules we have going forward. Another takeaway that I had from the speeches this morning was that this is a system in flux, that the rules are awaiting to be redefined. So I think there's a lot of intellectual debate to be had, and of course, as we saw from Minister Motegi, Japan will play a really important role in this sort of defining these roles going forward. I first came to Japan in 1989, just at the height of the bubble. Fantastic time to be a young man in Japan then. I had a lot of fun. However, this, in my sort of 30-odd years of looking at Japan, this is the first time that in the last sort of, particularly since the second Abe administration, the first time that I see Japan actually trying to lay an intellectual claim to setting the rules for the world. This is a really important development. I was really struck by the Avril's talk about the man from Ohio. I think that's going to be one of the sort of takeaways we all have from today. And that was sort of similar in intensity in terms of my response to Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables. There's a few really important phrases that I think go to try to explain the zeitgeist of just resentment, of anger, of bewilderment at how the liberal international order hasn't really served everyone. As a coda to that, I would advise every single politician globally to read Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky, I was very lucky in my first degree to study Russian, and I immersed myself in all of Dostoevsky's works. And he is one of the great authors who really understands anger. He understands shame, and he understands the will of the human being to behave irrationally. And of course, this sort of dovetails a little bit into Brexit, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the great phrases that's now doing the rounds in articles, op-eds, and so on comes from Dostoevsky's Underground Man. So sort of leave you with another quote, which I hope you will remember, which is, "Twice 2 is 4 is no longer life, but the beginning of death." And I think this is such a sort of good quotation because it shows how liberal democracy, it sort of applies to the discussion of liberal international order, liberal democracy, goes to the point that Avril was talking about in terms of how the liberal order has not defended, has not really brought economic benefits to everyone. I think this sort of points to the emphasis of liberal democracy, of liberalism, on governance, on technocracy, and so on. And of course, this has sort of taken politics out of the liberal order and really, I think, contributed to the backlash that we see today. I think it's right to talk about making liberal order, liberal international democracy, the liberal international order relevant. It's a battle, actually, that I think has to be fought. It's right also to talk about flaws. We shouldn't be a monopoly. Obviously, the liberal order was the only thing that was left after the fall of the Soviet Union. This is a monopoly, and like all monopolies, it's got lazy. And I think there's a really important political case to be made for sort of enlisting, re-enlisting support for this project. As a coda to this bit of my response, I think Thierry is absolutely right to suggest that there is no return to the sunny uplands of yore that we think we enjoyed post-45. I think that Donald Trump, always say with Donald Trump, you have to play the ball and not the man. If you play the man, you go off into a sort of rabbit hole of other sort of interesting things. But I think what Donald Trump has done, as Kissinger said in an interview in the Financial Times, he is sort of a full stop on a particular order. And what he is doing is forcing us, like we're doing today, to rethink our assumptions about that order and to try to sort of put down roots for a new order. So just to sort of as a piece of advice, we have the U.S. presidential election next year, 2020. To those of you that think that if Donald Trump loses, we return to what we had, I would say that's too optimistic, and actually we should be planning for a very different future for the international order. In trying to understand the solutions and where the liberal international order needs to go, I think we have to recognize that there have been there are some crises underlying this. One, I think, is a crisis in the West, an intellectual crisis, a strategic crisis. I think it's absolutely right, as I said, to talk about the failure of the liberal international order to deliver economically for many people, particularly those who are not in the 1%. The great financial crash crystallized these. Of course, these trends were evident, I think, many decades, or certainly immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, when India and China entered the global labor force for the first time, and the inadequate responses of governments, particularly in the West, to deal with what this meant for those sort of lower down the ladder, if you like, economically. So the great financial crisis, I think, sort of fed the intellectual crisis, undermined the Washington Consensus, which obviously sits underneath the liberal international order assumptions. But we also had, of course, the Greek sovereign crisis, the response of the EU to that. Greece is wrecked economically. I think there are lots of questions to be asked about how the response to that was handled. There are obviously, I'm personally British. I'm a phenomenal fan of the European Union. I am less, and it's obviously I'm not in a very sort of good position historically at the moment within the UK. However, I'm a skeptic about the euro, and I think there are lots of issues, sort of structural issues with the eurozone that need to be solved. Also, of course, look at the Argentinian crisis, the latest one that we've had. All of these things sort of feed the doubts about the wisdom of the Washington Consensus, particularly if you are a populist and you're trying to undermine the thing from within. And of course, we have Brexit as well there, sort of adding to the problems. Within this intellectual crisis, there is also the rise of China, of course. China hasn't really figured very largely in the debate so far, but I think China is the big elephant in the room that is feeding the intellectual, the sort of undermining of the intellectual confidence of the liberal international order, authoritarian capitalism. The interesting thing about China, of course, is that China is not a proselytizing power like the Soviet Union was. China is very much out for itself, using its financial strength to co-opt countries, to pull them into its orbit, and so on. But what China does is show you, if you are an authoritarian regime, how you can succeed by not absorbing and sort of imitating Western norms. I think this is an important challenge intellectually, certainly for the West. And of course, China is physically narrowing the gap with the United States. China, I think, often is overhyped. We were talking about the BRI later on, again, overhyped. China is weaker than it looks, but certainly that physical narrowing of the Chinese economy with the US economy, I think this is also feeding a sort of crisis of confidence within the US that, of course, Donald Trump has been exploiting. The second crisis that I see is the democratic crisis, a real crisis of liberal democracy. As I said earlier, the sort of liberal democratic system, I think, has become too associated with governance, too associated with technocratic rule. The unrest in Chile was mentioned, of course, and if you look at Chile objectively, it sort of ticks all the boxes of the World Bank's doing business rankings. It is very well managed and so on. However, of course, that is not enough because of the detachment that that brings from politics. There's also been a collapse of trust in institutions, and I think this is one of the things that sort of drove Donald Trump's victory back in 2016, also drove Brexit, also in 2016, the vote to leave the EU. And this trust in institutions is corrosive, very toxic for liberal democracy, because, of course, liberal democracy depends on these institutions, many of them sort of sitting outside politics. Witness also, of course, the rise in populism, particularly in Eastern Europe, but not just in Eastern Europe. I think, again, in Brexit, we have a sort of another symptom of this populist surge with the government, Boris Johnson, talking about the will of the people. We have a very interesting clash in the UK between representative democracy and direct democracy, and we see this also elsewhere in Europe. Witness, of course, as well, Hungary and Poland at the moment. They're very much beacons of populism, but also in Western Europe, Italy, and others. I think, as there's the point that you made earlier in the introduction, there's also an interaction, I think this is not yet fully understood, with social media and the emergent effects of social media, and particularly with how people are getting used to demanding things directly through social media rather than mediating them through their representatives in Parliament. And we see that again very, very much so in the UK. My final point now is, what should we do about it? And I think that any solution to the problems, any setting of rules that we have going forward has to have a big economic component. We need to reboot economic governance to make it more relevant to all of those that feel that they've been left out. I suspect that in many Western governments, economic policy will be redistributive rather than accumulative. So in the glory days of the UK of New Labour, when you had Peter Mandelson, one of the architects of New Labour, saying that how relaxed he was about people getting filthy rich, that is the sort of accumulative side of what we've had. I suspect that going forward it'll be redistributive as well. Also, I think, as Minister Motegi said, my final point here, the international order itself will need to change. And of course, this is most important for weaker states. They do have to act. This is not a nice to have. So Japan, the countries of the EU itself have an absolutely critical role to play here. And why I'm sort of encouraged here, and a sort of bit of good news, I think, is that Japan, for the very first time in my 30 years of sort of watching and absorbing and loving Japan, finally realizes that it has agency. So Japan does have a role. China would like to consign any country that isn't China or the US to the small country category. But of course, Japan is itself a very large economy, has a very, as Minister Motegi also said, and others have said, has an important soft power clout, which of course contrasts very, very significantly with China's sharp power. So China has agency, Japan has agency, and also I think from this we're finally starting to have an alternative view that the future of Asia does not have to be about China. Other countries can contribute to the debate, but also pull China in, absorb it, and make sure that China is what we would see as a responsible player within the region. I think one of Prime Minister Abe's legacies, and this is my final couple of points now, one of Prime Minister Abe's legacies, I think when he started his second term in 2012, he was thinking constitutional revision, very sort of heavy weight on the defense side, and obviously he's made some progress there by his terms. But I think one of his really key legacies will be this sort of embedding this role of Japan as a driver of change, as a driver of multilateralism, so creating new linkages. We've talked about the CPTPP. I have to admit that when the US pulled out, I thought this would be curtains for the TPP as it was then. But under Japan's drive and that of others as well, Australia and others, the TPP now lives again. The EU, EPA, SPA, all of that. This is really important for sort of pushing the multilateral, the globalist agenda. I think the big question, however, and this is where I'll leave it, is the medium powers. Obviously, they must do what they're doing. EU, Japan, very important, but can they be fully affected without the US being absolutely fully engaged as well? And I think that is the question that we'll probably be talking about in future sessions today and tomorrow. So with that, I will close. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ward. He's the Japan chair of the IISS, so he's well-versed on Japan and matters in Japan. And basically, I think he maintains a positive note on Japan. And of course, on the premise of that, he talked about the intellectual crisis facing the world today and the crisis to the post-war system. Now, he's not representing the UK, but I think as a Japanese individual, I think we are very interested in Brexit. But could we ask you about Brexit later? Okay. So we would like you to talk about Brexit later, in addition to other things. Now then, from Keio University, Professor Yuichi Hosoya, please deliver your initial remarks. And Professor Hosoya, I think, is very famous to all of you here, but he is a researcher on international relations, especially in relation to Europe and Japan-Europe relations. Thank you very much, Mr. Nakanishi, for that introduction. Now, Mr. Robert Ward spoke in such beautiful English, and so I don't want to follow with my poor English, so I would like to speak in beautiful Japanese. Now, I'd like to thank the organization and also President Sasae for organizing such a very, very rich and luxurious panel. And I'm sure that the staff had a very hard time preparing for this. About half a year ago, President Sasae talked about holding Japan's first international conference on these topics, and that was his dream. But I'm sure that it was very difficult for him to found such a conference, and it's led to very wonderful results. So I do hope that President Sasae can work for the next 6 months to work out a new liberal international order. And when you look at his proficiency in organizing this conference, I think he could probably do it in 6 months. So we have here many, many people that I truly respect, but I'm an expert in diplomatic history, so I would like to view the international order as it stands today from the perspective of history and also from the perspective of Japan by combining the Japanese and historical perspectives on the international order. So I have 3 points to make. The first point, as the keynote speakers, this is in reference to what the keynote speakers talked about, and especially what Mr. Montbrial said, that does a truly liberal international order exist? And in May, from Chatham House from the UK and Japan issued a report called UK and Japan was issued, and Ms. Akiko Yamanaka, I think, was a central person in this, incorporating between the two countries to issue a report. And so I wrote an article on defending the liberal international order, and I argued that Japan and the UK should defend that liberal international order. And the criticism that I received most was that you cannot defend something that does not exist. And so there were many more people that felt that no such thing as a liberal international order exists. So I can fully understand the point made by Mr. Montbrial. But still, having said so, I believe that a liberal international order does exist. And one proof of this would be if you go back 150 years in time. Well, 151 years ago, Japan was embarking on the road toward a modern state, and this was the Meiji Restoration. And the international community that Japan appeared in was power politics and imperialism. Those were the two characteristics. And then Hirofumi Ito, who later became the Prime Minister of Japan, visited the European countries to take a tour. And in Berlin, in Germany, he met Bismarck, the then Chancellor, and asked for his advice. And Bismarck's advice back then was, do not trust international law. It's just a piece of paper. If you want to resolve diplomatic issues, then military power is important. And Japanese people are so industrious, and they learned and worked too hard. And so they stood true to Bismarck's words, and international laws and international agencies were actually ignored, and the Japanese government then placed more importance on power politics, but that led to the World War II, and Japan, of course, lost the war. So the 150 years ago, the liberal international order did not exist, and power politics was what brought the Japanese government forward. And then in 1919, at the Paris Core Conference, all countries failed to create a new international order, and that's a very important fact. And this is the second point I want to make. That is, the current liberal international order is not perfect, and neither is it universal. It's imperfect, and it's premature, and it's fragile. That is, it can break any moment. Therefore, the liberal international order broke down in the 1930s because it was very immature. It was Japan who broke that order. And that very immature international order can break down any time in the future. And the international order is not universal. It covers only just a portion of the world, just a few countries of the world. And therefore, it may spread to other parts of the world, or it may, of course, be reduced in size. So currently, we are seeing a shrinkage and a decline of the international liberal order. That is, the liberal international order as we know it is weakening and is diminishing. So against that backdrop, I would like to make my third point. That is, this weak and premature and fragile liberal international order. Who is going to defend that weak and fragile order? In 2017, John Eikenberry of Princeton University wrote in Foreign Affairs a paper, and he said that Prime Minister Abe and Germany's Angela Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, are hold the fate of the liberal international order of the future, he said. And that was a surprise for me because Japan and Germany were, 70 or 80 years ago, were the axial powers during World War II. So they were on the side of breaking down the international order back then. But now Japan and Germany are defenders of the international order, and the U.S. and others, of course, due to criticism, are seeing a criticism against the Senate or the Parliament, and also against the international agencies. So their position have reversed. Why is that? As a person, a Japanese scholar of diplomatic history, that's because Japan and Germany have experienced authoritarianism and the fall of the international order before the war. Of course, I don't think that the pre-war Japanese government is equal to the Hitler's regime because there was democracy, but it could fall and fail very, very easily. And so they experienced how fragile the international order could be. So in the United States and the UK, there was they have little concern about the fall of the liberal democracy, but that's because they have not experienced the actual fall. I think that concern over the fall of the liberal democracy is stronger in Japan and Germany because we have experienced it, and that's why we want to uphold it. Now, 50 years later, or 30 years later, would be 2049, and if in 2049, the role that was played by the United States after World War II is taken over by China, and China remade the new world order. The liberal democratic order is premature and fragile, and probably the two words liberal and international will be removed. So China could create an order using digital technology. They can maintain order, but all liberal elements would be removed, so we will be spied upon using advanced technology. And also, the international nations will not enjoy a horizontal, equal relationship. There will be a more vertical, imperialist type of relationship. So when you think about that, do we want to go back to the days of power politics and imperialism going back 150 years, or would we want to enter into a world order without liberalism that China will create in 50 years' time? So I think when we think about that question, then we have a vision of what sort of a world order we want to create. Thank you very much. Now, each person has shared with us their very invaluable views. And this session, we want to take some questions from the floor before we conclude. And therefore, there's not much time left for the panelists to speak. And since there are 5 panelists, if you could keep your interjections to 5 minutes each. And so I would like to ask a question to you or to raise an issue. So if you could reply to that question in 5 minutes each. I'm sorry. So based on the content of the keynote and the views expressed by others, please express your own views or reactions to them.
So please keep it in 5 minutes. So Ambassador Sasae, Avril, and Thierry, to be followed by Mr. Ward and Professor Hosoya, in the order of having had to wait. Now, to Ambassador Sasae, I have to ask, having listened to the discussion, do you think it is still possible to build an international order based on free, fair, and transparent rules now that you had heard a very strong no from Mr. Montbrial? Thank you very much for the question. Well, I have learned many important things from your speeches, but still I am not swayed, and I am still a person who thinks it is possible. Being a French, I think Mr. Montbrial is really skeptical and really sarcastic, but he doesn't mean that the world is over. So basically, Western world had built this liberal international order, and outside of this Western world, there was Russia and China and many developing countries. So to them, rather than the liberal order, the economic gap or the independence was more important. So it's not that all the countries in the world were really the champions of this liberal international order. No, I quite agree with the points made by Professor Hosoya. We have to put this issue in an historical perspective, which is very important. And so any country cannot really free themselves from their historical from their history or their historical experience. He mentioned about Germany and Japan and the United Kingdom and the United States do not share this major failure like Germany and Japan. Japan lost in the World War II. That was, of course, a major failure, and we really had pledged not to repeat this mistake ever again. But if we try to learn too much from history and the past incidents, we would be obsessed with the past. So Japan lost in World War, and so anything related to war, anything related to military forces had been really avoided insistently by Japan. I'm not saying that Japan should become a military power, but we have to have some sensitivity to military power as well. And our neighbor, South Korea, had for a very long time been under the colonial rule, and so they have this trauma from the historical experience, and they are still bound by those historical trauma. And then China, for a very long time, they actually were invaded by those foreign powers, the major foreign powers. So that made them very adamant that there should be no intervention by foreign powers on their domestic matters. And the international opinion sometimes talk about those virtues and the positive aspects of the Chinese political system, but of course, based on their past experience, they really negate any possible interventions on the Chinese politics, and so they are also victim to their own history. So I think the current situation is quite fragile, and we have lost confidence. And the United States, that was the driver who took the leadership, is really swaying and shaking. And so other countries, of course, naturally would really lose confidence. But I'm not sure whether someone from Russia is here, but the Russian president said that liberal democracy is out of date, and the Chinese leader said liberal democracy, a Western liberal democratic pluralistic value, is not for China. We're not impressed by such values. They publicly and clearly, openly said that. So I think this is a challenge to this Western liberal democracy. So China, being a possible revisionist or expansionist to the West, and this diplomatic expansion and military expansion may have in its deep root anxiety against the Western values and the lack of confidence on Western values. So then, what should we do? I think there were several important points made in the statements made so far. A country like Japan had really developed its country in this framework of liberal democracy after World War II. And countries like Australia and New Zealand, and to the south, I think it's India as well. These countries support democracy as one of their principles. And although the ASEAN countries may be still fragile over a span of a decade or 2 decades, they are really coming to champion this liberal democracy. In Taiwan, whether I should call it a country or a region, I think the democracy of Taiwan compared to 10 or 20 years ago has developed. The same holds true for Vietnam and the ASEAN countries. There are, of course, ups and downs, but looking at the general trend, I think the principles that were initially shown by the United States are still adhered to. I think this is very important, and they have made some achievements. As mentioned by Minister Motegi earlier, Japan has this soft power. On top of this democratic value, we have this cultural power that we should value. And so the countries that share this value should get together. And I personally believe that the current democratic system and the free order is now being challenged. Maybe we're suffering a cold, but this is not fatal. I don't think that they would totally collapse or disappear. So, including the countries in the world, including the European countries and the United States, globalization was not necessarily going too much or exceeding the limits. These ethnic gaps and the discrepancies of the economy and the region and various other types of discrepancies need to be corrected, and also the national governance need to be reestablished so that liberal democracy can reemerge. I'm really an optimist, I know, but these countries that share the same will and desire should work together to see the reemergence of this liberal democracy. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sasae. Including Japan, there are countries in the world that should be a driver and take the initiative. And of course, these countries should be optimistic. Rather than being a pessimist, this strategic optimism is, of course, going to work much better. Thank you. Now, Ms. Haines, I would like to ask you a question, and please answer my question and share with us your impression so far. So in your keynote speech, you talked about this weakening international order under the status quo that, well, I think you were the view that we need to rebuild this international order. But as a specific problem, the emergence of these emerging nations in the current framework of the international order, how are we to deal with these emerging countries? As the international economic order, IMF and WTO had been founded, but they were up to now dominated by the West. The United States, EU, and Japan had influenced how these institutions were operated. That is not something that we can deny. So, if we are to establish this order, I think other countries like China and those non-Western countries should be given a greater voice, I believe. But as has been mentioned already, some of these countries already have established values that is quite different from the Western countries. And of course, those values would not change so easily. So it's not just China, but countries like China, India, and Russia, they have their own discrete values. So in this international order, what kind of roles do you think these countries should play, especially from an American perspective?
Thank you. So I think if I understood correctly, what you're asking is maybe the last part. How should China, India, other countries play a role that weren't necessarily as much a part of forming the international order post-World War II now in this context, and particularly where there may be differences of values and other issues. So there are places, obviously, within existing institutions, including the IMF, for example, where there needed to be a reestablishment of how much voice different parties had. And we participated in IMF reform as a context of that. And I think that's absolutely appropriate. But in many ways, it demonstrates one of the challenges that I pointed to, which is to say that IMF reform was something that was supported on a bipartisan basis within the United States, but we couldn't get it through Congress for ages. And it was because of the politicization, in a sense, of international mechanisms and the international order. And I think part of what I'm trying to indicate in the sense of one of the challenges that we're facing is that if we are going to see the international order grow, develop, and hopefully meet some of the challenges that we want it to meet for the future, I think we actually have to pay more attention to the fact that we are losing popular support in many of our countries for that international order, and that we need to remake that case, at least in the United States, and I'd say in Europe that's certainly a challenge, and that's going to be part of actually what strengthens the international order over time, and I think is a critical aspect of it. I think that there's no question that as we develop, different countries over time are going to require different voice in different types of mechanisms over different issues, right? It's sort of the devil is in the details of these things. And we're going to need to pay attention to those things. I think it's not just states, but it's also non-state actors that are of increasing importance and of power in today's world that are going to have to play a role in these issues as well. And that's something that we're going to have to accommodate in these new frameworks as we're moving forward. And I think the fact that, yes, I believe that many of our alliances are based on shared values, our defense alliances, where we agree to come to the defense of another country in the event that they're attacked. But the international order is much broader than that. And I think, in many respects, we may find common cause on issues that are as important as climate change or a variety of other things where we may not share all of the values with another country, but we still need and want to work with them in order to try to address those kinds of challenges. So I see that as critical. And then, if I may, I just want to, first of all, thank Professors Hosoya and Ward for their very thoughtful comments on these issues. And I particularly, if it's all right, I just comment on two things very quickly. One is, I think Professor Ward indicated that with Trump there will be change. And I think that's absolutely true. Has sort of caused us to re-examine and discuss the international order in a potentially productive way in some respects. But I think part of what I would say is that President Trump is a symptom of something bigger and is not necessarily the cause of the entire issue for us. And so, from my perspective, again, I see the loss of popular support, the concerns that we've reflected with respect to how the international affects our populations as being an issue that predates President Trump and is going to have to be something that we resolve in the context of remaking the international order for the future. That's one. I do think President Trump has had a particularly challenging approach to our allied relationships. I mean, I think I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I possibly can be. So I think that in that sense, that's the one piece that I believe that future administrations will come back to what we've seen before in the sense of supporting our allies in the context of defense relationships. That doesn't mean that our allies and partnerships won't change. They should change. They can change. That's something for the future. But I do think that that aspect of this administration is something that's a bit of a difference in this context. And I guess I'll leave it at that to keep to your time constraints. Thank you.
Thank you. ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much for being aware of the time and making your comments short. Thank you very much for that. Now, the international community faces a diversity of different issues. So although people emphasize the differences in values and between the United States and China and the confrontation, I think she said that there's room for compromise. And also the big issue in the United States is that in the United States, there is very low interest and consensus on foreign affairs or foreign issues. Thank you very much for making that point clear. Now then, Mr. Montbrial, I have a question to you. And so if you could answer that question and also talk or give us your comments on the other inputs. And now, at the end of your speech, you talked about the Kindleberger trap. And that is, in the 1930s, in the UK, lost the power to lead international order, and the U.S. had no will to lead international order. That was known as a Kindleberger trap. But when you look at the world today, the United States is weakening its intention or will to lead international order, and China, so the U.S. may have that power, but there is declining will to maintain the international order. And China may have the will to maintain the international order, but that may not be a sort of international order that is beneficial or for the international society. And currently, between the United States and China, I think there is a lack of trust that Mr. Montbrial said was very, very critical. So how do you view the Kindleberger trap today, and how can we avoid the Kindleberger trap under today's context?
Well, thank you. Well, first, all that takes back to one question that we do not have time to discuss fully. Personally, I disagree on the expression liberal international order. I think it's also a matter of words. So it's very important to be precise when we talk about words. So, of course, I can agree with much that Professor Hosoya says, but I think the language is confusing. And I maintain that nothing like a liberal international order ever existed. It existed partially in the West, and because at a time when the US was clearly the leader. Today there is a global world which is unprecedented, perhaps a little bit at the very beginning of the 20th century, and it ended with the First World War. And now we have, in fact, we have a heterogeneous system, and I think the title of this session is Challenges to Democratic Political System and the Liberal International Order. Ambassador Sasae spoke a little bit about the first part, but nobody else. So I would like to say a few words and conclude with Kindleberger. Well, challenges to democratic political systems. This is the basic issue, because in classical political theory, we have two concepts, two key concepts, which are legitimacy and efficiency. Legitimacy and efficiency. And the problem of liberal democracies today is that they are less and less efficient. And they are less and less efficient because the electoral system makes it by nature inherently inefficient, with constant elections, and of course here all the issues with social media and so forth and so on do not facilitate. So there is a lot of confusion, and people are elected even when they grossly and massively lie, like Mr. Boris Johnson in the UK, who massively lied during his campaign on Brexit, and nevertheless he won. So it's, frankly speaking, it's not good image for democracy. And it's not only in Britain that you can see such example. In France, Mrs. Le Pen makes higher and higher scores, and she's also constantly lying, and I could multiply these examples. And I do believe that in the long term, not in the short term, but in the long term, if legitimacy and efficiency do not match, something happens. In other words, you know, if over the long term a government is inefficient, a democratic government is inefficient, at the end of the day, it is democracy which loses. And so far, whether we like it or not, it's very easy to criticize the Chinese government, but what they have achieved in 40 years is absolutely amazing. It is unprecedented in history, perhaps to some extent the Meiji Revolution. But of course, there is some kind of Schadenfreude, as the Germans would say, that people who hope, in fact, that the Chinese will fail. No? But as I tried to say earlier, maybe that bet will not be successful. And it's easy, we have not spoken much of Russia, but when you look at the foreign policy successes of Putin in Russia, the Westerners should be humble. To a large extent, of course, Putin benefited, exploited our own mistakes. So that's the point. Now, the question is, also you have another issue, which is rules of the game. But ladies and gentlemen, rules of the game, what we are talking about, the international system as such, well, it cannot fall below. Thank you. Thank you very much. Rules of the game apply to the way people behave, including in diplomacy. You know, protocol, rule of the game, these are the politeness rules. These are issues which are major important to maintain civilization. If I just come here and I spit at your face, to say the least, I am not polite, okay? And what has Mr. Trump done? Insulting everybody every day? Now this is also spreading, you know. Mr. Bolsonaro is insulting everyone. No, he publicly insulted the wife of the French president. Mr. Erdogan now also is insulting everywhere. Now this insulting, this is not minor. This is essential. You know, the authoritarian regimes try to refrain from, well, if I look at Europe, Mr. Orban maybe at some point went to the limit. But what I am trying to say is that one of the reasons why I'm concerned with the evolution of the international system overall is that democracies misbehave. And I think many of you may know of Mr. Bagehot. Bagehot was a famous British publicist at the end of the 19th century. And he made an important distinction between what he called dignity and efficiency. And he said there are no two components for good government, dignity and efficiency. And this is something Churchill taught to the young Queen Elizabeth II. In this country, in Japan, with your institution, with our imperial institution, you have dignity. I think the core of the imperial function is dignity. And I think it is a remarkable success for the longevity also of this country. So far, I think in the UK, particularly Queen Elizabeth II, has been successful in maintaining dignity. But look, is President Trump Does he represent the dignified part of the presidential function of the US? And not only him, as I say. So the first part of this, challenges to democratic political system, the risk is that they are becoming less and less dignified and less efficient. And hence the question. And of course, and I stop here not to be too long, the economic aspect, that is the global economic governance aspect, is one aspect of this. To dismantle the WTO, to cooperate less and less within the international monetary framework is extraordinarily dangerous. I'm sorry to say that the 2007-8 financial crisis was created in the United States. And who paid for it? Mostly the rest of the world. This cannot be sustainable here. Yes, there is a real risk. In 2008, remember, there was really panics about the possibility of a crack comparable somewhat more or less to the interwar period. So the risk exists. And if I had indeed to set a priority, that would be, or two priorities, and I stop. First, that would be to reinforce economic governance because of a major financial economic collapse could indeed lead to the Kindleberger trap. And second, more generally, let us try, and all of us can do something in that direction, let us try to re-inject some CBMs, confidence-building measures at all levels of international life.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much indeed. So President Sasae said that he's an optimist of democracy. Strategic optimism is much better, is what he said. But Mr. Montbrial, I believe, just stated that legitimacy would have to exist together with efficiency, so that if we emphasize too much on legitimacy and lose efficiency, that democracy may sway and falter. So we should not, of course, be complacent, and hubris is something that we definitely would have to avoid. I think those importance had been emphasized by Mr. Montbrial. Thank you very much. So we're running out of time, so I'm sorry, I have to ask Mr. Ward and Professor Hosoya to just speak for 3 minutes. Now, you briefly talked about Brexit, Mr. Ward, but you didn't really elaborate on Brexit. But the Japanese are really concerned about the outcome. So what is your outlook of Brexit? And if UK really withdraws from the EU, there is expectation that they may play a greater role in the Indo-Pacific. So what would be the possible UK future role in Indo-Pacific? I'm sorry, I can only give you 3 minutes, but please be brief.
3 minutes for Brexit. You're asking something that's very difficult. I was in Japan. I was in Japan the day after the Brexit vote. I was trying to explain what had happened. I've been coming to Japan for the last couple of years, trying to explain this again to Japanese investors. And every time I try to explain Brexit, it's like talking about the contours of Mars. No one has a clue what I'm talking about because it is so inexplicable when you look at it from outside. I think the way that I try to look at it and try to explain it is as a revolution. So you can discount the sort of positive case made for the economics, because there's no serious economist that I've met that really paints a convicting convincing picture of why Brexit will be good for the UK economy. It won't. It's about politics. It's a revolution. I think when in 2016, when the vote was when the referendum campaign was going, I sort of look at my sort of knowledge of revolutions, and I think French. I think 1789, when the fishwives came to the Palace of Versailles and wanted to keep the system, they wanted to keep the king and queen, but they wanted reforms. And that's what you had, a sort of moderate approach in 2016 in the referendum. And then, of course, as all revolutions do, this radicalized. And I think we're now roughly thinking French Revolution 1793, 1794, so Reign of Terror, Robespierre and all of that. So very, very sort of radicalized on both sides, actually. So why the revolution analogy is good, I think, is because revolutions also last a long time. And I think the French Revolution didn't really end until Napoleon popped up and sort of shut everything down, sort of 1799 or thereabouts. So when you're thinking about the trajectory of Brexit, even though we may get a withdrawal deal, you know, things may work out for Boris Johnson, the idea that you can just get Brexit done is absolute fantasy, and it's part of the thing, the sort of the peddling of falsehoods that was being discussed about here earlier. Because, of course, all the negotiations with the EU have to be done within I would argue, quite a toxic political environment as well. Relations on both sides are not that good for various reasons. So with the UK, I think, the idea that being in the EU was going to be replaced by global Britain, well, that would feed into your point about the UK playing a role in the Indian Ocean and so on, and I'm sure in the Ministry of Defence there's sort of discussions about that. However, I feel that more broadly the UK is just at the time when the world is sort of coalescing into great sort of power blocks, the UK is just sort of popping out of the EU and will be on its own. It's obviously considerably larger economy than many economies in the world, but obviously, again, economically quite impaired, slower growth, reduced capabilities, and I think that one of the key issues for the UK going forward will be how it manages the relationship, the trilateral relationship between the EU on the one hand, China on the other, and of course the US as well. So for the UK, I would say to all our sort of Japanese friends out there, a very volatile, bumpy time, and this will last years, not months.
ありがとうございます。大変難しい問題を3分でお願いして恐縮ですけども、お答えをいただき。
I'm sorry, Major, talk about a very difficult topic in 3 minutes. Thank you very much for that explanation. Professor Hosoya, you're last. The liberal international order, you have to, well, Japan's role, you said, was to defend or to promote the liberal international order. That's what you mentioned. So, in fulfilling this role, I think one cause of concern for Japanese foreign policy today is our relationship with our neighbors. China, of course, our relationship with China is a big issue, but also our current relations with South Korea and also North Korea and Russia. And should I say the stagnation in foreign relations. Also, our relationship with Taiwan could be another. So, how about Japan's leadership in Asia? If you could take it in 3 minutes. Sorry. Thank you. Of course, even over lunchtime, you can't talk in detail, so I will keep it 3 minutes. But thank you very much for making those points. Now, Ms. Haines and Mr. Montbrial, if I may link my topic with theirs, I think President Trump in the United States is the symptom and not the cause, and this relates to that. I think that all countries around the world are based on egoism. That is, that they must be right, and that their love for themselves is growing, and partly caused by SNS. And President Trump is not resisting this. He is accelerating such a phenomena as a driver, and that has very major influence. But when it comes to Japan-U.S. alliance or NATO, of course, administration has taken steps to strengthen these relations. So political necessity versus the voters' recognition, I think is really diverting. There's a big distance between the two, and I think that was what was mentioned by Mr. Montbrial. And that applies to Japan as well. That is, I'm not saying that President Trump is wrong and Japan and Europe is right. That is not the case. Each country can fall to egoism, and each country thinks that their policy is right. And President Trump and the voters that supported him, if they understand that, if they feel that their allies should contribute more and work harder in the international committee, maybe that's partly right. But I think under the democratic system, I think that's making difficult to realize. And Professor Sasae said we should be optimistic, but as a historian, I'm a little bit pessimistic about that. That is the political needs, policy needs, and the recognition of the voters in the countries are diverging. Then what can leaders do, or what can the media or opinion leaders in the audience, experts do against such divergence of views? And so resisting against such a major trend and to adjust to that major trend, whether we're successful in doing that, I think would lead to some optimistic or skeptical results. And so as for Japan's relationship with Asia, and in our relationship with our neighbors, if we can resist to self-justification or egoism, and also China, whether we can make sure that China does not act just on their domestic interests, is very important. Thank you very much for answering in such a short time to a very, very pregnant question. There's lunchtime. We have to keep lunch time, so this session has only 5 minutes left. I'm sorry for my poor chairmanship, but I would like to take one question from the floor. So make it short, please. And please make clear who you're addressing your question to before you raise your question. So if you could raise your hand, please. Yes? Yes, the person in the front, please. So if you could state your name and your affiliation, of course. Thank you. Hirono from Seikei University. Thank you for this discussion. My question is to all of the panelists, but I'm sure there's no time. But the question is, COP25 began today. The climate change, I think, would be a major, will have a major impact when we attempt to create a society that we are discussing about. But there was no discussion about climate change. So why was it actually omitted from the discussion? Well, it was omitted because of the poor chairmanship, and I'm sure we should have covered climate change too. But COP25 was due to be held in Chile, but Spain is now the host. And of course, the challenges for the COP meeting, if maybe Dr. Montbrial, if you could talk about COP25 in order to conclude this session, would you please?
Well, 2 points on this issue. The first one is that it is the first time in world history that we are facing seriously an issue of negotiation having to do on something which impacts the whole world. So we have to learn how to deal with that. It's there is no experience. It's a new kind of diplomacy, so to speak. So it is not surprising that it is so difficult, especially as the way the various parties evaluate their own interest is not obvious. And in particular, you have the short-term, long-term balance, because for many of us, the most serious consequences are in the long term. And Mr. Bolsonaro, I mentioned, in the case of Brazil, has his own assessment, the Chinese another assessment, and so forth and so on. So I think that the process, we have to continue it, to deepen it, but let us not delude ourselves. We will not be able to stop the increase, the temperature increase on the planet with all its associated consequences, which means that we have also to prepare for adjustment on some very, very serious consequences. In the longer term, when the world becomes more and more integrated, this necessity, you know, to know how to negotiate better at the world level will be more and more imperative. And much quicker, the second aspect is that this perfectly illustrates the heterogeneity of the world, of the international system as it is today. You know, even within Europe, for instance, Poland, the Poles will pollute a lot in Europe. They tell us, okay, we are ready to reduce our coal production of electricity, but please pay for it. No. So this is related to the issue that has been touched a little bit this morning on inequalities. Who is going to pay for what?
Montbrial 先生、ありがとうございました。改めて司会の不手際。
Thank you very much, Dr. Montbrial. Due to my poor chairmanship, I was not able to give due time to all of the panelists, and we were not able to address many more questions from the audience. I'm very sorry about that. At the plenary session after lunch, or the breakout sessions, or tomorrow, we will have additional sessions, both plenary and breakouts. So based on the keynote speeches and the plenary session, I hope that we can further deepen the discussion at the ensuing sessions. So we'd like to thank all of the speakers who participated both from the keynote speeches all the way to the plenary session, and those two speakers who attended from the plenary session onwards. Thank you very much. Thank you. With this, we would like to conclude the morning session. In the afternoon, from 1400 hours, plenary session 2 will be held in the same room, the Ho'o room, and Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, and arms control and non-proliferation regimes are the topics for the breakout round, number 1, so we do hope that you'll participate.
通訳レシーバーは会場の外
Please make sure that you leave your simultaneous